The starship's engines hummed steadily as it sliced through the dark expanse of space, its destination a war-torn system far on the fringe of the galaxy. Aboard the vessel, a galaxy of struggles raged on. Alien factions vying for supremacy, humans fighting to maintain their fragile dominance. This was a war of attrition, one where every side believed they were justified, every soldier convinced that they fought for the greater good. Yet in the grand scheme of things, what did it matter who won? The galaxy had become a graveyard for the ideals of the past, and now only the cold thirst for power remained. The Zilithian Empire, a race of battle-hardened warriors known for their fierce honor, was the nemesis of the Human Federation. The Zilithians were formidable. Their physical prowess and advanced technology made them a nightmare on the battlefield. But even they had their cracks. Among their ranks was one warrior who had risen above all others, not just in skill, but in respect. Dralix, the paragon of Zilithian strength, commanded both fear and admiration. His name was whispered with reverence among his allies and dreaded by his enemies. Yet for all his power, Dralix had begun to question the cause he had fought for, the endless cycles of death, destruction, and conquest. Beneath the steel exterior of the battle-scarred warrior was a mind burdened with doubts about the righteousness of his actions. The war had become a personal trial for him. Each battle, each life taken, only served to deepen his disillusionment. The Zilithians, despite their nobility in combat, were a ruthless people, their loyalty to the Empire unwavering. Loyalty, however, was a double-edged sword. It was a trait Dralix had learned to wield, but began to fear. His entire life had been dictated by his duty to his people. Yet the more he fought, the more he wondered if there was another way. The most recent conflict had been a brutal one, the battle for a key planetary outpost. Both sides had sent their finest, and both had been prepared to fight to the death. The ground trembled with the sounds of explosives as Dralix led the charge, his massive, armored form cutting through enemy lines like a predator. He was unstoppable, a force of nature whose very presence on the battlefield could shift the tide of a fight. But as the battle wore on, his heart began to sink deeper into that same disillusionment. What were they really fighting for? The planet? The outpost? Or was it merely to sustain an endless war for war's sake? It was in the heat of that conflict, as the skies above rained fire and the ground below turned into a charred wasteland, that Dralix's world shattered. A well-placed explosion sent him flying, his massive body twisting in midair before crashing violently against the rubble of a destroyed structure. His world went black. When Dralix regained consciousness, the first thing he felt was pain, a searing, unrelenting agony that coursed through his body. His legs, he could not feel them. Panic gripped him, and his first instinct was to move, to rise. But his body betrayed him. His once strong limbs lay limp beneath him, useless. His breath quickened, fear creeping into his mind as he reached down, his hands trembling as they touched the cold metal of his armor. He tried to lift himself, to pull himself to his feet, but his body refused to obey. The battle raged on around him, but for Dralix, time seemed to slow. His surroundings were a blur of fire and smoke, the distant sounds of combat muffled as if through a thick wall. He struggled to focus, his vision swimming as he scanned the area. His comrades, the mighty Zilithians who had followed him in countless battles, were nowhere to be seen. The Zilithians fought with an unyielding code of honor, but in that moment, Dralix understood something far more bitter. Honor meant little when it came to survival. As he lay there, vulnerable and alone, the realization settled over him like a heavy weight. No one would come for him. His comrades would not risk their lives for someone who could no longer fight. He had become an expendable casualty. The truth was undeniable. To them, Dralix was no longer a warrior. He was a liability, a burden to their cause. He had been the heart of their victories, but now he was nothing more than a broken relic of the past. In that dark, lonely moment, Dralix felt a deep sense of betrayal. The very people he had fought for, the very empire he had bled for, would leave him to die. To them, He was just another soldier lost to the unforgiving chaos of war. And in that moment, his disillusionment became a tangible thing, a weight that crushed him from within. But then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the smoke and shadows, a solitary silhouette against the backdrop of destruction. At first, Drelix could not believe what he was seeing. It was a human soldier. The Human Federation had long been an enemy of the Zilithians, and yet here was one of them, standing before him. The soldier approached cautiously, their weapon at the ready, but their gaze was not one of fear or hostility. There was something different about this human, something unexpected. Drelix's instinct screamed at him to fight, to defend himself, but his body refused to obey. He was helpless, unable to move or react. The human soldier knelt beside him, their face obscured by a helmet, but there was a palpable sense of empathy in their actions. The soldier didn't hesitate. They quickly assessed Drelix's condition, noting the severity of his injuries, and then, to Drelix's shock, began to work. The soldier moved with purpose, using a small medical device to stabilize Drelix's condition. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The warrior and the soldier, two beings from warring factions, locked eyes. The Zilithian could sense the quiet resolve in the human's gaze, the unspoken understanding that transcended their species, their history, and their roles in the war. As the soldier began to lift him, Drelix's mind whirled. This human, this enemy, was saving him. Against all logic, against all reason, they had chosen to help. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Drelix's heart stirred with something other than anger. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this conflict than blind loyalty. Perhaps, in this moment, something could be salvaged from the ruins of their war. But even as the soldier carried him, the harsh realities of their galaxy loomed large. Drelix was no fool. He knew the risks for both of them. But in that fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something beyond the endless violence was possible. A flicker of hope, however small, was all it took to keep him fighting for a future that had once seemed lost. The Zilithian warrior's body lay limp in a makeshift medical tent, the surrounding chaos of war muted by the haze of pain and the cold, harsh reality of his new existence. The once powerful figure who had struck fear into enemies with a single glance now rested helplessly on a medbed, paralyzed from the waist down. Drelix could not move, could not feel anything below his chest, and the weight of his condition pressed heavily upon his mind. The very thing that had made him a legend in battle, his strength had betrayed him. The air around him was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and decay, remnants of a battle that had decimated the land. Zilithian soldiers moved about the camp, their faces masked with grim determination, too focused on the war at hand to notice or care for the fallen hero among them. Drelix's fellow warriors came and went, their brief glances toward him filled with nothing but indifference. To them, the warrior who had once led them to victory was now a broken relic, a casualty of a conflict they could scarcely remember the beginning of. Drelix's mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts. The mission, the battle, the bloodshed, it had all seemed so justified, so clear. But now, in the face of his own helplessness, he saw only the waste. All his years of fighting, his sacrifices, had culminated in this, a paralyzed body, abandoned by his own people. The Zilithians, bound by their code of strength and honor, would not come to his aid. They would not risk their lives to save him, for what could a paralyzed warrior offer? He was no longer an asset, just a liability. As Drelix lay there, lost in his thoughts, the door to the medical tent opened with a soft hiss. A figure entered, clad in the uniform of the Human Federation, a soldier with the distinctive blue and silver insignia marking their rank. The soldier's helmet was lowered, their face hidden, but the posture, the way they moved, suggested something different. Not the typical cold indifference of an enemy, but a quiet, purposeful resolve. The human stopped at the edge of Drelix's bed, kneeling down to his level. Drelix's heart lurched. His instincts told him to attack, to fight, to defend himself. This was the enemy. The humans were the very ones he had fought against in every battle, the ones he had seen as weak and undisciplined. But even as his mind screamed for him to act, his body remained motionless, his muscles unwilling to respond. The human soldier was already beginning to work, moving with quiet precision, connecting a series of medical instruments to Drelix's form. Drelix's mind reeled. Why would a human, one of his enemies, waste precious resources on a dying Zilithian? There was no gain in saving him, no advantage to be had. Yet here the soldier was, offering aid with a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with the violent world outside the tent. As the human soldier worked, Drelix's body was stabilized, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a flicker of something other than pain, relief, however fleeting. The soldier paused, her eyes meeting his. Her gaze was not filled with hatred or fear, as he had expected. Instead, it was filled with something far more perplexing, empathy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Drelix could not understand why she had come, why she had chosen to help him. It was not logic nor strategy. It defied everything he had known about the galaxy and its brutal ways. And yet, here she was doing what no one else had done, showing him mercy. "You should not have come," Drelix finally managed to rasp, his voice rough with both pain and confusion. "I am your enemy. There is no reason for you to waste your time on me." The soldier said nothing at first, merely adjusting the medbed settings to ensure Drelix's vital signs remained stable. She moved efficiently, her hands steady, but there was a tension in her every action, a hesitation that suggested an internal struggle. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost soothing, as if she were speaking to herself more than to him. "Sometimes there's more to fighting than just winning," she said. "Not everything is black and white." Drelix frowned, his mind grasping at her words. Her words were not the callous rhetoric of a soldier determined to win at all costs. She spoke as if she had seen the same disillusionment he had, as if she, too, questioned the endless cycle of violence that had defined their lives. And yet, there she was, standing before him, a human who had just saved his life. The warrior tried to sit up, but the effort was futile. His legs betrayed him again, and he fell back against the bed. Frustration flared in his chest, but there was nowhere to direct it. He was trapped in his own broken body, incapable of action. But as he lay there, helpless, the human soldier placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a brief moment of contact that grounded him in the reality of the situation. She was still here, despite everything. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why save me? I'm nothing but a broken weapon. There is no honor in what I've become." The soldier's expression softened behind her helmet, and she gave a small shake of her head. "You're wrong," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Honor isn't defined by your ability to fight. It's in the choices you make, even when no one is watching, even when it's hard." Drelix blinked, unable to comprehend the full weight of her words. She seemed so sure, so resolute in her beliefs. To the Zilithians, honor was a rigid construct, one based on strength, victory, and sacrifice. There was no place in their code for weakness or failure. Yet this human soldier, who had been trained to see him as an enemy, spoke of something entirely different. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tent, and the soldier quickly rose to her feet, her demeanor shifting to one of alertness. The door opened, and another human soldier entered, his posture stiff with authority. "How is the prisoner?" the newcomer asked, his tone cold but not unkind. The soldier glanced at Drelix before answering. "He's stable, but he'll need further treatment." The newcomer nodded, his eyes scanning Drelix briefly. "Don't get too attached. He's still the enemy." The soldier didn't respond, instead focusing on her work. As she continued to tend to the fallen warrior, Drelix felt a flicker of something stir within him, a strange, uncomfortable feeling. He had always fought for the Zilithians, for their empire, but in this moment, under the care of this human soldier, he began to question everything he had believed. For the first time, he wondered if perhaps there was another way. Drelix woke to the dim light of the medical tent, his body still aching, his mind clouded. He had not slept well in days, his dreams haunted by images of his people, warriors standing tall, proud and defiant, their faces twisted in scorn at his weakness. They were no longer just his comrades. They were ghosts that taunted him with the understanding that he was no longer one of them, no longer fit to fight. The human soldier was there again, her presence now a constant. She worked tirelessly at his side, adjusting the medical equipment, checking his vitals, making sure he was as comfortable as someone in his condition could be. Her name was Iona, and every movement she made was precise, efficient, like a well-practiced rhythm that Dralix had begun to recognize. In the beginning, he had resented her. He had believed she was simply doing her duty, some cold necessity born out of protocol. But now he wasn't so sure. There was something different about the way she treated him, something that he couldn't ignore. Iona was no longer the faceless enemy. She had become a person, someone who, despite everything, had chosen to help him. It was an unsettling thought. He tried to sit up again, his muscles protesting the movement, but the effort was futile. He could feel nothing below his waist, and the anger that flared in his chest was always followed by that sinking, suffocating realization that he was helpless. He had no control, not over his body, not over his life. Iona turned toward him when she heard him struggle. Her expression softened as she approached, a quiet concern in her eyes. "You're not ready to move yet," she said, her voice calm, steady. She placed a hand on his shoulder, gently pushing him back down. Dralix met her gaze, his frustration visible in the clenched muscles of his jaw. "I don't need your pity," he muttered, the words thick with bitterness. She didn't flinch. "I'm not giving you pity," Iona replied, her tone even. "I'm trying to help you heal." His gaze hardened. "Why? You don't have to help me. You're the enemy." She took a step back, her brow furrowing slightly. "Are we still enemies?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with a challenge. "You've been here for days. I've treated your wounds, made sure you survive. Do you really still believe we're enemies?" Dralix stared at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign of deception, any trace of the cruelty he had expected. But there was nothing, just sincerity. It unsettled him. "I'm nothing but a liability to you," he growled, unable to hold back his frustration. "I'm no longer a warrior. I'm just a cripple, a reminder of what this war has done to us. To me." Iona's eyes softened further, and for a moment, she said nothing. Instead, she reached for a small device at her belt and activated it. A soft hum filled the air as she adjusted his medbed. The healing process wasn't instantaneous, but the steady rhythm of the machine's pulse gave Dralix a strange comfort. "You're not a reminder of anything, Dralix," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "You're a person, not a weapon, not a casualty of war. A person." The word struck him harder than he expected. It wasn't what she had said, but how she had said it. The absence of judgment, the absence of that cold detachment he had grown to expect from those who fought in this war. Iona's kindness was not the pity he feared. It was something deeper, something more unsettling. It was the kind of compassion that made him question everything. "You don't understand," Dralix said, his voice low, filled with a bitter resolve. "The Zilithians, they'll never accept me again. I'm a disgrace. They won't forgive me for this. I'll never fight for them again." Iona's brow furrowed in thought, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she moved to the corner of the room, returning with a small, handheld device. She glanced at Dralix as she approached, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Maybe they won't accept you," she said carefully. "But maybe you're not meant to fight for them anymore. Maybe it's time to ask yourself what kind of life you want from here on out." Dralix's mind reeled. Her words hung in the air like an echo, a thought that had never occurred to him. What kind of life did he want? He had always defined himself by his strength, his ability to fight. That was his purpose, his identity. But now everything had changed. He was no longer the warrior he had once been. "You think I have a choice?" he asked bitterly, his voice rising. "You think they'll just let me walk away from everything I've done? From everything I've fought for?" Iona's face remained calm, but her eyes had hardened. "You always have a choice," she replied, her voice firm. "The only question is whether you're willing to make it." Dralix stared at her, speechless for a moment. Her certainty, her unwavering belief that there was still something more for him, was foreign to him. It was a dangerous hope, one that he had long since discarded. The war had taught him that there was only one way to survive: fight or die. There was no room for weakness, no room for mercy. There was only the endless cycle of bloodshed. And yet, here was this human soldier standing before him, offering him a path out. A path he had never imagined. "You can help me," Drelix said finally, his voice hoarse with the weight of his own internal battle. "But you can't change what's been done. I've killed so many. I've done things that can't be undone." Iona's eyes softened again, and she knelt beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "No one can undo the past," she said quietly. "But you can decide what you do with what's left of your future." Her words were like a distant echo, resonating in his mind long after she had finished speaking. He wanted to resist. He wanted to hold on to his bitterness, his anger, because it was all he had left. But there was something in her words, something he couldn't ignore. For the first time in days, Drelix allowed himself to wonder if there was a way forward that didn't involve more bloodshed. A way that didn't define him by his past mistakes, his lost battles. "I don't know if I can," he said quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. "You don't have to know right now," Iona replied. "But when you're ready, you'll have a choice." As she moved away, Drelix remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The battle was far from over, not just the one outside, but the one raging inside him. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Drelix wasn't sure which way he would choose. The days blurred together, each one a hazy repetition of medical treatments and quiet conversations. Drelix's condition improved slowly but steadily, his vital signs stabilizing as the human soldiers did what they could to keep him alive. Yet despite the progress, there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, something that weighed heavily on him and on the camp as a whole. The war still raged beyond the confines of this small medical station, and soon he would be nothing more than a pawn again, a tool to be used by whichever side was desperate enough to claim him. Iona's presence was a constant, as steady as the pulse of the machines that kept him alive. At first, Drelix had refused to acknowledge the significance of her efforts. She was simply doing her duty, he thought. She was a soldier, nothing more. But over time, he began to notice the small things. The way she spoke to him, not with the icy contempt he had grown used to from his own people, but with a kind of quiet respect. The way her eyes softened when she looked at him, a subtle hint of concern that wasn't rooted in obligation, but something else entirely. Her actions had been nothing short of selfless, but there was still a part of him that didn't know how to reconcile this kindness with the enmity that had defined his relationship with humans for so long. One evening, as the camp fell into the familiar rhythm of nightfall, Iona entered the tent with a tray of food. Drelix was lying on his back, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought. His body still refused to cooperate, but he was getting used to the feeling of helplessness. It had become his new normal. Iona set the tray down beside him and sat on the edge of the bed. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a bridge they were both unsure how to cross. "How are you feeling?" Iona asked, her voice soft, but the question carried weight. It wasn't a simple inquiry about his physical condition. It was something more, something that lingered in the air, unspoken. Drelix's gaze flickered toward her, his eyes dark with a mixture of frustration and confusion. He had come to respect Iona in a way he hadn't expected, but respect didn't make things any easier. "I'm fine," he said, his tone flat. "I'm alive, aren't I?" Iona didn't flinch at his bitterness. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "Alive? Yes," she said, "but that doesn't mean you're okay." Drelix shifted uncomfortably. He was tired of talking about his condition, tired of the constant reminders of his weakness. He had spent a lifetime fighting, earning respect with each battle, but now he was nothing more than a casualty of his own past. "What do you want me to say, Iona?" he asked, his voice low, his frustration seeping through. "That I'm grateful you're keeping me alive? That I appreciate your mercy?" Iona's gaze softened, and for the first time, Drelix saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before, something that resembled pain. "No," she said quietly. "I don't want you to say anything, but I want you to understand something. What you've done, what you've become, it doesn't define who you are. And I think you know that deep down." Drelix looked away, his jaw tightening. She was right, of course. He knew it. He had always known it. The guilt, the shame, the weight of his actions. They were a part of him, but they were not all of him. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the war, the endless fighting, had stripped him of the very thing that made him who he was. Honor, strength, purpose. Everything had been tied to his ability to fight, to lead his people into battle. Now all of that had been taken away. "I don't know who I am anymore," Drelix admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign, uncomfortable on his tongue. But there was the truth he had been too afraid to admit. He didn't know. He didn't know what to fight for, or why he was still alive when so many others had fallen. Iona reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. "You're still Drelix," she said, her voice warm, reassuring. "You're not just a soldier. You're a person, and that's worth something. Maybe it's time you let yourself believe that." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Drelix closed his eyes, trying to push the emotions that swelled within him back into the depths of his mind. He wasn't ready to accept her kindness. He wasn't ready to accept the possibility that there was more to his life than the war. But as much as he tried to deny it, a part of him wanted to believe her. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, his voice raw with the weight of his confusion. "You don't owe me anything. I'm your enemy. I've killed your people. Why would you help me? Why would you care?" Iona paused, her hand still resting on his arm. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, Drelix saw something flicker in her eyes, something deeper than sympathy. "Because I believe in something more than this war," she said quietly. "I believe in the possibility of change. I believe that people, even enemies, can make different choices. I believe you can make a different choice." The sincerity in her words struck Drelix harder than any blow he had ever taken. It wasn't just her compassion that caught him off guard. It was the quiet strength behind her words. Iona didn't just see him as an enemy, a casualty of war. She saw him as a person, someone capable of choosing a different path, someone capable of redemption. Drelix didn't know what to say to that. The weight of her belief in him felt like a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. The very idea that there could be a future for him outside of the war, outside of the Zalithian Empire, was something he hadn't allowed himself to entertain. But now, as he lay there, helpless and broken, the thought lingered in his mind, a fragile seed of possibility. For the first time in a long while, Drelix didn't know what would happen next. But he knew one thing. Iona had given him something he hadn't even realized he had lost: hope. And in a galaxy that had long since abandoned hope, that alone was enough to keep him alive. The morning was quiet when Drelix woke, the oppressive silence outside the medical tent marking the pause between battles. He hadn't expected it, this kind of stillness. It felt strange to him now, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. The war had a rhythm, a steady thrum of chaos that couldn't be stopped by mere silence. But today, in this place, there was nothing but calm. Iona had come in early, just as she always did, but there was something different in the way she moved. She wasn't rushing to check his vitals or to monitor his condition. She was simply standing by the entrance, her back to him, staring out at the distant horizon. Her posture was straighter than usual, her expression taut. Something was wrong, and Drelix could feel it in the air. "Are we under attack?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. It was a question that lingered between them. He hadn't heard any alarms, no immediate signs of danger, but that didn't mean much. The humans were good at staying silent when they needed to. Iona turned toward him slowly, her eyes narrowed, but the intensity in them wasn't directed at him. It was as if she was weighing something in her mind, deciding whether or not to speak. "No," she replied finally, her tone tight. "But there's been a change in orders. The command wants us to move out. We're leaving this camp in a few hours." Drelix's chest tightened. He didn't have to ask what that meant. The war was calling them back. No matter what had transpired here, no matter what fragile connection had started to form between him and the human soldiers, it didn't matter. The battlefield was always waiting. I see, he said, his voice flat. So, it's back to the front lines then? Iona didn't respond immediately. Instead, she moved closer, sitting beside him on the bed. Her presence was calm, but there was an underlying tension that Dralix could feel in every fiber of his being. Dralix, she began carefully, as if choosing her words, I know you're not ready to go back out there. I can see it, but the decision isn't in our hands. He clenched his jaw, not looking at her. I don't belong out there anymore, he muttered, his bitterness rising again. I'm not a soldier anymore. I can't even walk. Iona reached out, her hand touching his arm again, a familiar gesture, though the warmth he once felt from it now seemed more like a tether. A reminder of the things he could no longer do. You're not the only one struggling with this, she said, her voice softer than before. None of us are the same after everything we've seen. But you don't have to go back to the front lines if you don't want to. There's another option. Dralix looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. Another option, he asked. He didn't understand. She couldn't be suggesting what he thought she was. You don't think they'll let me stay behind, do you? You think they'll allow someone like me to just walk away? After everything I've done? Iona's gaze was unwavering. No, they won't let you walk away. But that doesn't mean you have to go back to fighting either. There's a place for you, Dralix. A place where you don't have to pick up a weapon, where you can still be useful. Dralix stared at her, disbelief flooding his chest. Where is this place? He asked, his voice sharp with frustration. What could possibly be left for me? I've already failed everyone. Iona's expression softened, a mixture of empathy and determination in her eyes. There are other roles to play in this world. You don't have to be a soldier to be valuable. And if you're truly done with fighting, there are ways to make sure you never have to again. He met her gaze for a long moment, searching her face for any trace of a lie, any sign that she was offering him false hope. But there was nothing, just sincerity. And for some strange reason, that sincerity made his chest tighten. He had spent years shutting out anyone who tried to offer him something different. But now, with Iona's words hanging between them, he felt the familiar walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. I can't stay here, he said finally, his voice quiet, almost to himself. I'm not that man anymore. Iona gave a small nod, as if she had been expecting this response. Then maybe it's time you became someone else, she said. Someone who has the power to choose his own future. Dralix shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't asked for this kind of choice. He hadn't wanted to be anything other than the warrior he had always been. But now, as he lay there, broken and helpless, the possibility of a new path seemed like something he couldn't ignore. Maybe, just maybe, there was something worth living for beyond the endless fight. The tent flaps stirred, and one of the soldiers entered, breaking the moment. He looked at the two of them, his gaze flicking between Dralix and Iona, but he said nothing. We leave in an hour, the soldier said simply. You're coming with us, right? Iona? Iona hesitated for just a beat, her eyes flicking back to Dralix. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady. I'm coming. The soldier nodded and left, leaving Dralix and Iona alone once again. There was a finality to the exchange, a clear signal that the time for decisions had come. Dralix's mind raced, his thoughts a chaotic blur. He wanted to be angry, to lash out at the unfairness of it all. But in the quiet, he realized that he had already been given a choice. He could go back to the war, back to the violence, the death, and the destruction. Or he could try something different. He could try to walk away from the only life he had known and carve out a new existence. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it didn't seem entirely impossible. Iona stood up, her hand brushing the back of his arm one last time. Whatever you decide, Dralix, she said quietly, I believe you can make it. You don't have to be a warrior to be strong. And with that, she turned and left the tent, her figure disappearing into the morning light. Dralix remained alone, his thoughts swirling, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time, he wasn't sure which side he was on anymore. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. The days following the announcement of their departure from the medical camp passed in a blur for Drelix. The once familiar clamor of soldiers preparing for battle felt distant, as though it were happening in someone else's life. Iona's quiet presence remained constant, but there was a new distance between them now, a silence where words once filled the gaps. Drelix had not made his decision. His mind was a battleground, torn between the life he had known and the uncertain future that Iona had suggested. As the time to leave drew nearer, a strange sense of finality settled over him. The medical supplies were packed, the tents disassembled, and the small, ragtag camp was being dismantled as if it had never existed. Drelix sat on the edge of the cot, staring at his hands, still marveling at how weak they had become, how different the warrior he had once been felt from the broken man before him. He had always prided himself on his strength, his ability to lead, to fight, to command. Now, his body betrayed him, and even his mind seemed to falter when he tried to focus on the future. "I'm not ready," he whispered to himself. He wasn't sure if he was saying it to Iona or to the universe. The sound of footsteps outside his tent caught his attention, and he looked up, expecting to see the familiar form of Iona. But when the flap parted, it wasn't her. Instead, it was one of the soldiers from their unit, his face grim, his movements efficient. He was carrying a datapad, and his expression made it clear that he wasn't here for pleasantries. "Drelix," the soldier began, his voice tight with urgency. "We've received new orders. We're being reassigned to a different front. We leave within the hour." Drelix's heart sank at the news. Another front. Another battlefield. The words felt like an echo from his past, each one digging deeper into the dark pit he had been trying to escape. He was no longer fit for combat, no longer the soldier he had once been, and yet here was another call to arms. "I understand," Drelix said, though his voice lacked conviction. He hadn't expected anything different. This was his fate, to be nothing more than a tool, to be used until there was nothing left to extract from him. The soldier nodded curtly, seemingly oblivious to the internal battle raging inside the alien warrior. "Get yourself ready. We leave as soon as possible." With that, he turned and left the tent, leaving Drelix alone with his thoughts. The weight of his situation pressed down on him again, heavier than before. He could stay. He could go with them, back to the front, back to the life he knew. He could be the soldier, the warrior. But could he really? The decision was not an easy one, and for the first time, Drelix found himself questioning everything he had believed about himself. What was left for him on the battlefield? Glory? Honor? Was that really worth the price he had paid? The lives he had taken, the people he had destroyed, they would never be forgotten, no matter how far he ran. No, there had to be more to life than the endless cycle of violence. But could he walk away from it? Could he really leave it all behind? As if on cue, Iona entered the tent, her presence grounding him as she always did. She moved toward him, her expression soft, but her eyes held a question. She had known something was coming, something that neither of them could avoid forever. "Drelix," she said, her voice gentle, but firm, "I know you're struggling. But the decision doesn't have to be made today. There's still time." Drelix stood up abruptly, his frustration flaring. "Time," he repeated bitterly. "Time for what? To keep running in circles? To keep pretending that I can be something I'm not? I'm not fit to be a soldier anymore. Iona, I'm not even fit to walk." His voice cracked on the last word, and the anger that had been bubbling beneath the surface broke free. "What do you want from me? What do you want me to do?" Iona didn't flinch at his outburst. She stepped closer, her eyes unwavering. "I want you to make a choice, Drelix. Not for me, not for anyone else, but for yourself. You spent your whole life being what others needed you to be. It's time you decided who you want to be." The words hung in the air between them, both a challenge and a lifeline. Drelix could feel the truth of them, like a weight in his chest. He had spent his life being defined by the expectations of others, by the war, by his people, by his role as a warrior. But now, for the first time, he was being asked to define himself. It was both terrifying and freeing. "I don't know who I am without the war," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. The admission felt like a betrayal, but it was the truth. I've spent so long fighting, so long following orders, I don't know what else is left. Iona reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but grounding. You don't have to know all the answers right now, but you do have the power to choose. You've always had that power. Don't let the war take that from you. For the first time, Dralix met her gaze fully, really looked at her. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment, only understanding. And something else, something that felt like hope. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet before the storm, the moment before the decision that would change everything. Dralix took a deep breath and nodded, though his heart still raced. He wasn't ready. He wasn't sure he would ever be ready, but he couldn't keep running forever. I'll come with you, he said finally, his voice steady. I'll find my own way. I don't know what that looks like, but I'll find it. Iona smiled, a rare expression that softened the sharpness of her features. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take the first step. The rest will come. And for the first time, as they stood together in the quiet tent, Dralix felt the faintest stirrings of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The beginning of a new path, one that wasn't defined by the war, by blood, or by duty. It wasn't a victory, but it was a chance. And that was enough for now. As they walked out of the tent together, Dralix didn't know what the future would hold. But he was ready to face it.